My name is Arnie Scheinbold. I am the president of AFCC, a roadmap to research in child custody evaluation. Dr. Leslie Droz is in private practice in Newport Beach. For those of you who don't know, she is the editor of the Journal of Child Custody and has just co-edited probably one of the best books on the market right now for child custody evaluators, Parenting Plan Evaluations. We have Dr. Nancy Olson, psychologist in private practice in San Rafael, California. She also has written numerous articles with Dr. Droz on alienation. She's taught, as she said to me, many workshops, over two, on child custody evaluations and a variety of other topics. Dr. Michael Saini. Dr. Saini is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Canada in social work. He's involved in research projects related to virtual visitation and parenting in the context of high conflict.
Good morning, everyone. Here are the top 10 take-home points. Cognitive errors are universal. Research errors are extremely common, and we need to learn to recognize and avoid them. We need to keep with the research in the field, and there are some practical ways to keep with the research, which we're going to be talking about. There are ways to evaluate the quality of the research that you read. That's going to be important to do. And there are ways to describe the research, its quality, its appropriate application to your given case. There are ways to look at your own work with an eye recognizing error and bias, which we all have and we all do, and the question is, how do we handle it? And evaluators with research literacy are less likely to be fooled by low-quality studies. You need to guard against the use of pseudoscience, which we'll define in a while. It's what you're not supposed to be doing. You should be responsible for knowing basic information about research design and statistical analysis. And there is more research than anyone could possibly read comprehensively. And one of our take-home things for all of you is that we really would like research groups formed. And it doesn't have to just be people in your neighborhood, given that you can do things electronically these days. But we're suggesting that out of this conference that everyone form research groups where perhaps once a month you meet on all of these free conference call things, and there's a review of a particular topic or a particular journal or something like that, so those in your group stay up to date. So why do we need a roadmap for research? Once upon a time, the use of research was the road less traveled. Suddenly that road became a congested highway. So now you hear things in court like the research says, and everybody stops like E.F. Hutton advertisement and listens to the researcher. Today one can find support on the internet for almost any theory. And one of my other sort of pet peeves is I've been text messaged from colleagues in court who are testifying a particular point, and this has happened twice, where they've said, find me a study that backs up my point. It's kind of the reverse way you're supposed to do it. And I have a clinical practice too, so I'm not on call to do that. So I bring that up not because I welcome people contacting me, but because that's the opposite way you're supposed to do it. You should look through the research, find what supports and disconfirms different points and issues, and then decide which way you're going to say it, and be prepared to talk about contrary research. A roadmap is needed to help make sense of the research and to distinguish between junk science and high quality. We have a roadmap that you have a copy of. So we have this roadmap that you have a handout of, and what we're saying is that at conferences like this and in journals that you read like FCR or JCC or lots of other journals, that's how you fill up your research tank. And then in the preparation and planning stage, as you get a case, you ferret out what the issues are, and you use research, your knowledge of research, to ferret out what the issues are on a given topic. And you come up with a preliminary decision tree, and you collect data, and all of that is framed by the research that you've already got in your research decision tank before. And then your analysis and synthesis of the data is informed by the research, as are hopefully your recommendations. And then when you review or you consult or revise what you've written, research is going to be important to take a look at as well. How do we know what we know?
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just wondering.
I'm not going to say which it is.
Mr. Secretary,
I'm right here. I'm right here.
We're hoping you come to know what you know. So there's all sorts of different ways you can go. There are self-reports by clients. There are your personal beliefs and assumptions, which reign pretty high up on the influence list. There's a question about what's supported by the legal community. Then there's your intuition or your gut feelings about things, which are not necessarily bad, but it's better that you have some objective measures, the way to look at things as well. There's your personal style. Well, I just do evaluations this way, and I've been doing them this way for 20 years, so why should I change? That kind of thing. You may have experience with a few cases. Let's say that you get a case and somebody is coming in and saying, I'm a domestic violence victim, and they've got this whole litany of things, and you just think that your general stance is, I just think that I usually approach it with quite a bit of skepticism. Somebody's just using that to have a leg up in the research. Or somebody believes immediately when they hear an allegation of alienation without knowing what the research is and without checking out alternative hypotheses. There's practice wisdom, and all of this leads to many biases that we have that inform our subjective beliefs. There's selective evidence or confirmation bias. There's one of the best articles I've ever read by David Martindale in 2005 in Journal of Child Custody on confirmatory bias and confirmatory distortion. One should have that in their package of things simply to make sure you're not doing that. And there are suggestions about ways not to engage in that. To gather facts that support certain conclusions but disregard others, that's what confirmation bias is. There's recency bias, to place more attention on more recent information. So the thing you get in at the last minute, you give more weight to that. Obviously, you need to find ways to offset that. There's source bias, to reject something if we have a bias against a person, organization, or a group to which the person belongs. There's repetition bias. I get that a lot in custody evaluations, where somebody just keeps sending me the same material over and over again, as if I either A, haven't read it, or I'll be influenced more if I see it for the 10th time. And that's the willingness to believe what we have been told most often and by the greatest number of different sources. There's wishful thinking or optimism bias, which in doing reviews of other people's work oftentimes happens, where somebody, they get through all of this conflict and their way, their own kind of personal way of dealing with conflict, that is the evaluator, is to kind of give an optimistic spin to it, and these people will be able to work it out if only. And sometimes you do better to list both strengths and vulnerabilities for the parents and not just put an optimistic spin on it. And then it's published, so it must be good quality. People go all sorts of places to retrieve information. Based on a critical appraisal of 60,352 articles from 170 journals, McKibben et al. In 2004 found that only 6.8% of published articles were deemed high-quality studies. So before you hang a hat on one of these, take a look at it. Published reports can make erroneous claims that may not be based on high-quality evidence, and contradictions in research findings may have more to do with the quality or lack of quality of the studies. What we're aiming for is evidence-based practice. Judges, lawyers, and parents can be seduced by an expert who offers certainty in a context of uncertainty. So you get the expert up there who looks like he or she knows what they're doing, and people believe it. And so there's a tremendous amount of responsibility on our shoulders, especially if you have a reasonable amount of self-confidence. And so you probably could sell most anything, including a study that doesn't have a good basis to it. Scientific procedures are designed to protect practitioner from relying on unfounded assumptions. Explicit knowledge that subjective beliefs could be, acknowledgement that subjective beliefs could be wrong. You need to acknowledge that. Social science places a high value on objective truths based on systemic observations. For those of you who can't read this from the back, there's been a lot of research lately on your condition. Now, I'm sorry, I didn't read any of it. And this is briefly a decision tree that we go through in doing evaluations. There's the preparation and planning stage, which in terms of research, that's what I mentioned earlier is on this roadmap for research of fill up the tank. But that's where you decide if you have the expertise to take the evaluation, you read case documents, you come up with the specific issues. Then we're talking about coming up with preliminary decision tree and initial hypotheses and clustering the data. And at that point, how you cluster that data is related to research as well. And then there's the data collection, and how you collect the data ought to be informed by research. In other words, how do you interview young children? There's a good amount of information out there about how to interview young children, and your interviews should be in sync with that. And then there's data analysis, synthesis, and corresponding recommendations, reflection, review, consultation, and revision. And then we're suggesting that you complete a checklist, you identify and report any limitations of your data, and that's all included in the writing of the report.
We laid the roadmap out to look at what research you might look at each phase of the evaluation, as Leslie said. So I want to point out why. In the U.S., every year, 100,000 people die from preventable medical errors. That is the equivalent of 4 jumbo jets a week crashing with everyone on board, dying. So the medical profession has they have figured out, trying to figure out systems to help prevent some of those. I think it is highly unlikely that family law systems do not have systematic errors, preventable errors. We just don't have a way to count them. So it's our contention that we need a systematic way to go about custody evaluations, and in this case we're talking about ways that the research could inform it. So you need to start with what you need just to go into the field. Now in California you have to get 40 hours of training and a whole bunch of stuff, which people take in more or less. Some people treat it like traffic school and don't pay much attention. There's no test at the end. But you need a lot of background information over and above what you got in your graduate school and your education. Preparatory work includes knowing social science research. We're suggesting that you have a system of files, either electronic or paper, in which you have the best research you found on various topics, so you have a place to go to get it. When you find new research, you can put it in the file. To populate it, you go to these conferences. You update your library with peer-reviewed journals and books that you stay up to date on, that you read, as opposed to what I have sometimes found myself doing, that I buy them, and then if they sit there, it's sort of almost like I read it, but that doesn't count. You can use access online to Family Court Review. You can get to the Journal of Child Custody through Taylor and Francis. I think you probably have to subscribe, but you can get back journals when you're somewhere away from your library at home. There are other journals you can access. You can get APA levels of access. You can use your local medical school libraries will sometimes let you buy access, or you can find somebody You have to know the standards and guidelines. Again, this is preaching to the choir because you guys are here and you know about the AFCC standards and guidelines, but many people don't. You need to look for systematic reviews and topical reviews. The Keeley and Droz Parenting Plan book has systematic reviews of the research on various topics. It's really important to keep up with reviews. You probably should do something which a lot of us went into clinical practice, not academics, and left graduate school with a feeling, thank God I never have to think about research again. But in fact, you need to understand, you need to have a basic level of literacy, and there are courses that you can take that are, kind of like languages where you get the basics to be able, you need the basics of research literacy. The decision tree that Mike's going to present later gives you some outline of ways to evaluate the quality of a research study. But then you've decided to take the case. And this is not just the background information that you need, but you need to start looking at what are the issues in this case. What are the systematic reviews about you're reading, okay, so this is what you're getting. You identify the issues, you hear what everybody is contending is the case, get a preliminary overview, and then you start to map out the issues. You get hypotheses in a very concrete way. I would recommend write them down as opposed to just keeping them in the back of your head. And then you start thinking, okay, what is the research that bears on that? Are there systematic reviews? Are there topical overviews that can identify what the debates are, what the tensions are, what's known and not known? If you think, for example, about child sexual abuse, there's a lot of information about it. If you get a case, you need to think about, okay, what's the age of the child? What are the allegations? What's the relationship with the alleged perpetrator? What is the research that has information about those factors? How common is the issue? There's a base rate issue Mike is going to talk about more. What's the prevalence, base rate, etiology in the normal population of separating families and families involved in higher levels of conflict? And frankly, I think it's good to know the research on the families with high levels of conflicts who haven't separated. A lot of it in the marital conflict books that Cummings and his co-authors have published. What do we know about how you best explore these particular issues in the case right in front of you? What tests, what measures, what procedures, so that you know you're using the ones that are best practice, and they change. I mean, I have my favorites, but they change. You get new versions. There are some people who are updating them all the time. What's the research on the factors that are associated with the issues that you're looking at? For example, if you're looking at issues that have allegations of domestic violence and you're concerned about it, maybe no one's raised the question about substance abuse, but if you know the research, you know that there's a very high comorbidity with substance abuse and domestic violence. So you may want to look into that even though nobody initially brought it up. You want to know what are the factors that co-occur so that you're sure you're looking at them. We think you should make a preliminary decision tree that lays out what your hypotheses are and clusters those. What are the things that seem to be occurring together? Substance abuse and domestic violence, questions about alienation and interruptions in the attachment systems with both parents, problems in the attachment systems with both parents. Things start to cluster together. You're going to need eventually to look at whether those things are interacting with each other, whether they're separate or intermixed. And there is research, there is social science research on many of these issues. You could look at the example we gave here on this slide is the presence of alienation and estrangement and domestic violence, but there are many such clusters of co-occurring factors. What are the relationships that have been found about these parenting issues? How have these issues been previously clustered? Sometimes wrongly, sometimes rightly. What does the research literature say, and how much of it is any good or good enough to be useful? What are the variations that you find in the research within these clusters and between them that would help you differentiate? This family fits here but not there. What does that mean? Are there factors that have more weight? I mean, an obvious example is safety a stronger factor than well-being. Then you're going to look at data collection. That was all just kind of planning. You look at data collection, and there's a lot of information about how to interview children, as Leslie mentioned, the advantages and disadvantages of doing using structured interview formats versus open-ended, free-form interview format. You will start to look at ways to collect data, and you should know the background research on those instruments that you choose to use. And if you're using an instrument that does not have a research basis for it, particularly in evaluating litigating families, you need to be very well prepared to explain why you're doing it. It's not to say that everyone only uses the same measures, but you need to be very clear about what you're using and why you're using it. And there are some where you're like, are you going to interview a child in the office or in their home? May depend on a lot of factors. Some of them practical, how far away do they live, and so on. But some of them to do with the age of the child and the history of the child, and so on. There's research on factors like observation effect bias and the ways that the observer changes the observed behavior that you need to know. Key questions at this stage is, what does the research say about the various methods, as I said? What can we learn from common practice in the field? Now, here's where AFCC is great, because you get to hear from everybody, both in the workshops and in the conversations around the place. You get to hear all kinds of things. So what are people doing, and what are they not doing, and what are the styles? Are some methods better than others for collecting reliable and valid information? Yeah. Are there methods that don't provide the kind of reliable, valid information we're looking for? Yeah. And about the time you review an evaluation in which the person doing the evaluation has said that they did a sand tray with the child, and the child was interested in mermaids, and the interest in mermaids demonstrated that she'd been molested because mermaids don't have vaginas, you get a feeling that perhaps that wasn't the most reliable method that was used. In the analysis and synthesis, that's a real example, I'm sorry to tell you. That's a real example. There's a lot of research about the prognosis, and it's important to look at what is the likelihood, positive leaning custody evaluators, and I have to say I think I'm one of them, and I'm always trying to look out for the optimism bias, tend to think that if you refer people for therapy, they'll get better. There's research on who gets better in what kind of therapy, and it's a really good idea to have a look at that before you make a generic recommendation, particularly one that has consequences that you've made the custody recommendations based on it. Like a person who has been determined to be a batterer should go to batterer's intervention program for 26 weeks. Well, there is data about what the rates of recidivism are in people who've come from certain kinds of batterers intervention programs. You should know that. The analysis and synthesis and connection to recommendations is very difficult. And I think you go back to your hypotheses, you look at the research, you look at what you've got. What does the research say about interactions among these things? I mean, many of the best studies have covariate models that talk about the ways that factors interact. Do some carry more weight than others? What are the long-term consequences? What are the protective buffers? Here's where the positive bias helps. Are there things that help children in certain kinds who have experienced certain kinds of events, help parents recover their parenting ability? Are there certain kinds of treatment that help? Is there a certain kind of encouragement for community involvement that can provide a buffer? It's very important. Your recommendations are going to flow out of all this, and they're going to need to be very specific and very concrete, and they're going to need to take account of the factors that you found. We were talking yesterday in the Institute about the number of custody evaluations that identify domestic violence and then give recommendations that don't account for it at all. They don't mention it. It's like a different, you're reading along and it's all really clear, and then the recommendations don't connect. You have to connect and you have to connect all the issues in these complex ways. You're looking at the practical things like the age and developmental level of the kids and changes in risk factors and protective buffers, whether those are likely to change over time, whether they can, whether there's sort of how possible is it that those factors will change over time. And your questions at this point are there some parenting plan arrangements that generally work better than others for children? Now, here's where people are in different camps. I think it's a good idea to go back and read the research literature on it. Joint versus sole custody is a big fight, but there is actually data. And the question is, what factors seem to be related to which parenting plans might work for which children? That's what you really need to be doing. What factors contribute to the parent's ability to make joint decisions? If you're going to recommend joint legal custody, what are the factors that will make it easier or make it possible for this particular parent and that parent to be able to do that? If the child or the parent is amenable to receiving counseling, what evidence is there that it would do them any good? And what kind of counseling? If you think they should have it, you should also recommend what the goals might be and what kind of therapist should be contacted. And if you know your community really well, I work in a small community where we know most of the therapists, you can give 3 or 4 names of people who would be appropriate. And the last thing, that level, which is not directly, well, it's partly related to research, is that you go back when you finished your work and you revise it and you review it and you look at it. You want to be sure that you follow the best practices. And it's a really good idea to go back over your thing and think, did I leave something out? Did I do something unequal in how I dealt with the parents? It's a really good idea, if you do second opinions, you get used to the way that you review them looking for flaws. It's a really good idea to go back and read your own with the same eye, because somebody else may, for one thing, so defensively it's a good idea to have a look at it. But in addition, it's a really good check on bias, on language. You're considering the process. Did you follow all the steps? Did you follow the standards? Is there some way you should vet for bias? I fairly often have a colleague read a report because I may not be sure that I did justice to the family, and I want to know if there's something in the report that would be inflammatory. And now Mike's going to tell you how to do all this stuff that I've been telling you should do.
So we've been talking a lot about including research within custody evaluations. And we've done a roadmap to try and help you to start thinking about how to integrate that evidence. But of course, not all research is the same. And we need to be careful of what we're bringing in and how we're critically appraising this research. And we're strongly suggesting that as evaluators, you need to develop a research literacy. You need to be able to make some distinctions between pseudoscience and evidence-based science. And we're going to just go walk through here and ideas and some thinkings about how to hopefully move you in that direction. So here's a nice quote. It says, "He uses statistics as a drunken man uses a lamppost, for support rather than illumination." And what I like about this quote is that it reminds us that when we look at research, we are talking about the probability of something happening, some event occurring, based on the research and what that research tells us. What it does not get at is prediction. It cannot predict with 100% accuracy, because the research says this, then that will happen. Because in one study we find that joint custody was beneficial, we can't say that joint custody is going to be the right choice for this child. And we need to be clear of how we're interpreting and using that evidence. And of course, not all this evidence is the same. It says 60% of statistics cited in newspapers' headlines are falsified. It's up to us as consumers of research to gain some understanding about what is considered to be good and bad research so we can make those decisions. Because statistics is the only science that enables different experts using the same figures to draw different conclusions. You can change whether or not a result is statistically significant simply by increasing the sample size. And so we need to know what is this statistical finding really telling us. You can have a statistically significant finding, but have a really small effect size. And so even though it's by chance occurring, it still does not mean that it has lots of weight to it. And of course, if you torture those numbers, they'll confess to anything. So here are 5 common flaws in research, and I'm using specific examples within separation and divorce. The first one is ignoring the baseline. When we ignore the baseline, we often look at just the raw scores when we make comparisons, and we don't go back and adjust those to make those comparisons more equal. So for instance, we could say that California has more cases that go to trial than Ontario, which is probably true. But of course, there are more people in California and more people going through the court. So it makes sense that more cases are going to trial. If you go back and adjust the percentage of cases in California that go to trial and the cases that go to trial in Ontario and have a more equal comparison, then you end up with a different result. So we must avoid using raw scores when we're making these comparisons. So for instance, we know that 10% of give or take, percent of people are considered to be high conflict. So here's an example, false allegations of sexual abuse rates. In the 1980s, there's a number of studies that came out that showed that there was huge percentages of false allegations of sexual abuse. And so all of these studies, if you look at them, they're based on 18 children, 7 cases. Nearly all were false allegations, and this one, where there's been only a few people included in the sample. So it started to drive home the point that in custody cases, false sexual abuse allegations are rampant. But of course, these samples were too small, and the time frames were too limited to provide us really good information that we could generalize on. So if you use a wider lens, what do you see? You see that Jones and McGrath, and they looked at all of the cases within their child protection services, that the false allegation was 6%. Much different than those smaller samples and the results that they gave. I've recently looked at in Canada, across Canada, using the Canadian Incident Study, which is in review right now. We looked at all child maltreatment investigations, and out of those, 12% involved a custody dispute. And again, if you look at false allegations, they're a small group. And if you look at them specifically sexual abuse, it's even a smaller group. Most of allegations within the context of child welfare and custody involve exposure to violence and physical abuse allegations. So comparing apples and oranges, sole custody versus joint custody or shared custody. But what if these populations were different? So Bauserman's study reviewed 33 studies and compared sole custody, joint custody, and also intact family. Bauserman found that joint custody children scored higher on adjustment. And it's a very positive result. But when you look at it, first of all, the effect sizes, if we know something about research, Cohen's D effect sizes, an effect size of 0.23 is considered to be a small to moderate effect. But also, Bauserman points out in the study on page 99 that selection bias cannot be ruled out. But that point gets misplaced when we report on this study. So parents who had better relationships prior to or during may have self-selected themselves into these joint custody, shared custody arrangement. Unrepresented findings. This happens when a study is completed with a sample, and that sample, the results of that sample then get generalized beyond that intended sample. So bias and purposive samples are not meant to make inferences beyond that sample. If we're using non-random samples or self-selection of the group of people that we want to interview to get a certain type of information across, then we can't go back and now suggest that this represents more than what it was intended to do. Response rate as well. If you give 100 surveys out and only 50 people respond, then you need to figure out, well, what happened to the other 50? Why did they not follow through? And then attrition. We're finding right now, we're doing a systematic review of intervention for rape and sexual assault, and we're finding if you take in the attrition rate, those who actually make it through treatment do well, but they need the tenacity to be able to make it through treatment. And so for those who don't, that's a whole subgroup that we need to know more about. Can we generalize these findings then? Baker has done a wonderful job of providing very detailed stories about the consequences of alienation for adult children. These are based on 38 young adults. She recruited them through the internet and through word of mouth. And they provide us a good understanding for these young adults, what it was like for them to go through experiencing alienation. But can we generalize those results to suggest that all kids will experience negative consequence? False causality. Just because two variables are related or associated or correlated does not mean that one causes the others to change. So children living in joint custody arrangements, parenting plans, and parent-child relationship. So a parenting plan of joint custody will not necessarily mean that it will improve the parent-child relationship. Other factors, including what the children have to say about these arrangements, need to be taken into consideration. So when we look at cause, we're looking at various different types of cause relationships. So A may cause B, but the same could be true that B causes A. A and B may partly cause each other, which then creates perhaps C. A and B are both causal by a third factor, and it's also possible that A and B are just simply related due to chance. So what does this mean? We need to look further than the danger of bread. What is dangerous about bread? Well, research has found that more than 98% of convicted felons are bread eaters. Fully half of all children grew up in bread-consuming homes. More than 90% of violent crimes are committed within 24 hours of eating bread. Bread is made of a substance called dough, which has been proven that as little as a pound of dough can suffocate a mouse. And primitive tribal societies that have no bread exhibit lower occurrence of cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, and osteoporosis. So we need to be really careful before we start making assumptions about causal relationships. Overnights. The research on overnights is growing. There's a couple studies that are really helping us out to help us figure out what those markers may be. But we still are a long ways to go. A long way to go before we start predicting for this particular child that this outcome will occur. Instead, we use this information to provide markers for us, to provide, as Marcia talked about last night, those touchstones, to help us move towards understanding a little better about what we're dealing with when we look at these complex issues. As consumers of research and gaining research literacy, the first thing you can do is start searching for the studies. Google is a wonderful source. So we've been really emphasizing pseudoscience versus evidence-based practice. Pseudoscience is very attractive because it provides certainty. It gives you the right answer. Maybe not the right answer, but at least it seems that it gives you the right answer. Because it's quick, it's definitive, and people like that. They don't want to hear researchers like me come up here and say, it depends. More research is needed, as I always write in the conclusions of my papers. But depends is an important part of the journey of understanding research. Depends means that in some cases, this may occur. There is a probability that this has an influence on the decisions that you're making. But don't then assume that it's going to be predictive to 100%, because then you go into the territory of pseudoscience. So for assessing the quality, it's important to know both the strengths and the limitations of the evidence that you're looking for. And it's important to put in those limitations very clearly and transparently within your reports as you're spelling out the pros and cons. So when you're looking at a research decision tree, you're looking at first the integrity and the credibility of the evidence. Is it at arm's length, or is there an advocacy component to this? Were the samples randomly chosen, or were they picked to make a point or to provide certain information. Were the designs quantitative or qualitative? Both are really good. It depends on the question. If I'm going to do a participatory action research study with Aboriginal children because I want their participation, I want to hear their experiences, qualitative obviously is the best example. If I want to describe a relationship that is occurring in a larger population, then a survey, a quantitative study makes sense. If I'm trying to evaluate a treatment program, then a random controlled trial with a comparison where groups are randomly assigned to treatment and control is the preferred approach. What biases are there? So what measures were used? And has the field come to terms with some consensus around how to define and measure these concepts? What about testing? Attrition, response rates, things we talked about. And then the statistical significance. Is it there or not? And if it is it clinically relevant? Is it relevant to your context, to the people that you're working with? So solutions for using research. When new research comes up, when new topics come up, when there's something happening in your case that you want to know more about, look at what the research says. Not what people say about what the research says, but go look at it for yourself. Find the primary studies and start critiquing these. The more you critique, when my students start doing an assignment where they have to do a critical appraisal of the evidence, they're intimidated. Well, how am I supposed to be doing this critique? These are published studies. And then they get into it and they just rip these things apart. And I say, no, you're going too far. You're making the point. You'll notice that the more you spend time critiquing evidence, the more attuned you will be to some of those flaws and some of the benefit. Be clear about small sample sizes when you're reporting these studies and when you're talking about these studies. Don't get trapped in overgeneralizing beyond where the sample what the sample was intended to do. Talk about the setting, the context. Be clear about how you're reporting these studies in your evaluations. If there's not enough evidence, or if the evidence is based on a couple studies, make that clear. You don't have to say, well, there's nothing out there, or there's nothing any good out there. You can say, there are a couple studies, and from the couple studies, we seem to understand this. The trend seems to be this. So instead of saying the research says, ... consider the trend suggests, or it looks like the studies are talking about this. Focus on the primary studies rather than on the summaries. So there are good summaries out there of reviews that critically appraise the evidence. But also go back to the primary studies, because if somebody wrote 10 years ago that one type of arrangement was better than the other, even though within that primary study there's tons of complexity where they themselves talk about their own limitations of the study, those get passed off. And the only thing that gets repeated is that positive result. And so going back and looking at yourself, you'll notice whether or not sound bites have been taken out with leaving the rest behind. Be transparent about the knowledge and how it was created and the assumptions that underlie it. What are the theories that are being generated by these studies? Again, push back on overgeneralizations and cookie-cutter approaches to complex problems. When we're working with high-conflict families in custody evaluations, they're coming at us with complex issues. We don't want to separate their problems into isolated bits of research studies to try and move things forward. We have to understand the full complexity of what's going on. So consider the complexity of individual experiences. Know that as people come to us with complex needs, we need to ensure that the research and our application of research is done so in a way that understands and responds to that complexity, and to move away from simple thinking about whether or not the research supports or does not support our positions. And there are a number of journals that are out there that address issues of separation and divorce. Rather than, what I do is I have subscriptions to both these two journals, which are both excellent and very on target for the work that we do, but then also searching through Google and electronic databases and so on to try and get a more a broader scope, because you'll be amazed of the type of journals that publish issues that are relevant to separation and divorce. Because as academics and as researchers and as people who are publishing in this area, we often look for different journals to publish, to try and spread out our work in different journals. So I've published in Families and Society, in the Family Court Review, in children and youth review. So many different sources. So it's better to look at the topics rather than necessarily go and get the journals.
Well, there's one that I'm not sure what the question is. There is just so much research that we need for these various pit stops on the roadmap, and where could one start? Well, it's for me, but where you start is by doing exactly what Mike said. You get the books, you get in the bibliographies to follow up there on articles that are relevant to what you're trying to find out. You, if you're just starting out and you're thinking, where do you start? Find an experienced person in your community, and you mentor with them and ask them what you should be reading and studying. I'm not sure the where do you start. Where do you start researching a topic would be specifically with Google and with some of the other search engines, but where do you start trying to wrap your mind around all this information? I actually think a mentor is the best way to go. I think it's very hard to do this by yourself out in the field.
And I think using an example of some reviews that are in FCR or that are in Dr. Keelian, my book, like if I've got a case that has alienation in it, you look at FCR for everything that's been written about alienation. Or there's an incredible chapter that Mike Siney and Jan Johnston and Nick Bala and Barbara Jo Fidler wrote in the parenting plan evaluation book, in which they analyze all the different studies that are out there on various topics. P.S. Mike's talking about that this afternoon in a workshop. And that would be a place to start, but I wouldn't end there. If something is relevant to the context in which you're working, then go get that study. I think that's part of the point that Mike was making that I want to underline, is go read the original research. But we can't all do that. So you need to look at the reviews and look at good reviews like this one that I was referring to that Mike et al. Did, and then look within that so that you're prepared to say something about the study and you don't just know the name of the study or the authors. Because what happens if you get a wise attorney who says, tell me about the sample size in that, and you're going, I don't know, and you're going to look worse than if you never said anything about it. Yeah.
Just another comment about that is that not only should you read those primary studies, but you should read the full primary studies.
Not just the abstract?
Not just the abstract. And I'll tell you why. If I'm going to give a paper out to a journal to be reviewed, and they come back with lots of comments and a lot of suggestions, and I make those changes, if they don't provide any comments about the abstract, I may not change the abstract, so now it no longer fits what the actual paper says. And so you may get a whole different feel of the paper by looking at the abstract than if you look at the study. And we have a paper that's out right now on abstract development in the social sciences, and the problems with the misleading information that's in those pieces of the reports.
So I want to tell a story for a second about be careful what you quote and who you quote. So I was reviewing somebody's report, and I'm reading along, and it's like about 2 in the afternoon, and I'm sort of, it's warm in my office, and I'm not really candidly, the report was a bit boring, and all of a sudden I read a sentence that says all children, it's clear in the clearly stated in the literature, or maybe it said the research says, which is another one of my pet peeve phrases to not use, said all children who say that they're sexually abused have indeed been sexually abused. I wake up and I see that they've quoted someone there, and so I play a game with myself, and I put my hand over the paper at the point where the person is quoted. And I'm saying to myself all sorts of things about who the heck would say that. And then I take my hand off, and it says Drozd, 2012. And I called the attorney who had hired me to review this report, and I said, So do you think I would say that? Do you think I would say that? And she said, oh my God, I wish you'd say something that definitive. You always do all this probability stuff. And the case turned on that one phrase, because there's no way I was going to support that report if that's what's done there about a topic that I know something about and that I didn't say. And supposedly I said that at a conference, and that the attorney happened to be at as well. So be really careful about what you say. I mean, it sounds really good. This is where the pseudoscience stuff comes in. It sounds good. It sounds definitive. It sounds like what everybody wants to hear. I don't know about that particular phrase, but it sounds great. Make sure it's accurate, because there are very few things that we know about in this field that you can say, the research definitively said. We seem to spend an inordinate amount of time or resources educating and informing evaluators, judges, and attorneys on the situations of separating families. Why don't we put more effort into educating, diverting, and informing the parents who drive the legal issues based on wants and desires? Not much to disagree about that. I would agree.
You've got a way to do it. I think everybody in this room would be thrilled to hear it. Any way to get to them before it starts going off the cliff is probably a good idea. Can you put it in writing?
I have a comment from someone, which is a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I think that is part of the problem that we're all running into. My concern about using research and parenting plan evaluations is that the first thing that people are doing is they're overgeneralizing, and they're making comments that are going to drive this to the point where people may not pay any attention when you say the trend in the research is, because people have misused that. You all know what happened in the use of insurance in this country for psychiatric hospitalizations. They basically don't exist anymore because it was overused in the 1980s and 1990s, or the overuse of the word codependent in the 1990s, until anybody who was nice to the friend sitting next to them was now codependent. I would rather that not be what happens with the research, that we overgeneralize so much that we're really not saying anything.
Just another comment about the early prevention programs. Somebody made a comment that in some states that there are mandatory parenting courses. And so we are acknowledging those. I am suggesting, though, that more research is needed about these parenting programs, because generally speaking, the research suggests that they do really well for parents. They give information about the courts, about separation, about children's experiences and how to protect them. What we need to do, though, is be a little more sophisticated in trying to separate the levels of conflict and the emotional commotion that's going on in some families, because we know from other research that it's hard to take new information in if your emotions are high. So the relationships between emotions and cognitions are important to consider. And can we then triage families to move past education systems into something that's more comprehensive if they have more vulnerable emotional needs that need to be taken care of. So I think there's wonderful work going on regarding parent education, and I'm hoping that this will continue to evolve. I think my major point that I want to get across is the difference between probability and prediction. I think oftentimes we move too much towards prediction. Research will never allow us to predict what's going to happen in the future. It can only provide us with knowledge about what may happen in the future. And so if we're looking at research to predict, so research says this and therefore this is going to happen, then we will be disappointed about what research can and cannot do for us. And so a more complex understanding of probability is important for us to move the field forward. Thank you.